centre of excellence, and we would look closely at that before making any decision. But I think it's important to stress that having a more precise definition and having this due diligence process is there precisely to ensure that decisions like this are not made on the basis of the subjective judgment of any individual minister. They're made only after a careful and thoughtful process.
But do you have a view, I hear what you say about the dangers of a subjective assertion by an individual, even one as powerful as you, Mr. Gove, but do you have a view on whether or not the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign projecting that slogan onto Big Ben, a symbol of our liberal democracy, and them saying that they don't just tolerate that slogan, but they chant it, and they do so with vigour and purpose. Do you have a view on whether or not that should be defined as extremism?
Well, again, the key thing about the role that I have is that...
it's not to take a view. Okay.
Exactly, to take a view only informed by rigorous evidence.
Okay. Let's take another test case, just interested in your view of this. What if someone directly involved in our liberal democracy, for example, I don't know, by giving £10 million to the Conservative Party, and then quite separately perhaps receiving for his company over £100 million for NHS contracts. What if such a person said that Diane Abbott MP should be shot? Would that be something that the Centre for Excellence ought to look at as potentially a good way to meet their definition of extremism?
Well, again, I know the specific case that you're referring to, and
that was Frank Hester, yeah.
Yes, and that statement was racist. It was horrific, and again, my understanding is that the gentleman concerned has shown full contrition and apologised for that. But yes, certainly, if
it's the sort of thing the Centre for Excellence might look at, though, might it not? I mean, he's talking about he might have been joking, and maybe it all hinges on whether or not you think he was joking, or whether or not he meant it seriously. But that's the sort of thing the Centre for Excellence might look at.
Well, again, we have to be clear that we're looking at organisations with a particular ideology. That the individual concerned said something that was horrific. As someone who was themselves targeted by an extremist who wanted to kill me and then went on to kill a friend of mine, I take these issues incredibly seriously. And so, again, I wouldn't want to conflate those motivated by extremist ideology with an individual comment, however horrific, which has quite rightly been called out and which has quite rightly led to an apology.
Let me put to you the concerns of David Anderson, KC, former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, who spoke to us a short time ago.
I think there are a lot of questions that still have to be asked about this policy. First, who is it aimed at? The definition remains extremely broad. For example, it catches people who advance an ideology which negates the fundamental rights of others. One can imagine both sides of the trans debate leaping on that one. There's a question of what can't people do if they are deemed to be extremists. The government emphasises that this is non-statutory. In other words, a bill won't be coming to Parliament. And they say it's a matter for government because it's all about an instruction to government departments not to give extremists a platform. I don't take much comfort from that. I don't think it's just a matter for government, because I think you're also affecting a lot of people potentially by branding them as extremists. They're going to need some way of challenging what the gentleman in Whitehall says about that. I'm not scaremongering here, but I am raising real questions that need to be answered. It affects potentially the freedoms and the reputations of an awful lot of people.
What do you say to that, Mr. Gove?
Well, Mr. Anderson, I hope, is aware that we already have a definition, and that definition, which has been around since 2011, which is used to inform the PREVENT programme, is one which, at the moment, I think is probably capable of being criticised in the terms that Mr. Anderson has used, because if he's concerned about any form of definition of extremism, then a definition which talks about fundamental British values, which is capable of even wider interpretation than the more focused and precise definition that we have, would give rise to all of the concerns that Mr. Anderson has expressed and more. So I think by making the definition more precise and by making it clear that there is a rigorous process, we eliminate, or at the very, very least, dramatically reduce the risks of which Mr. Anderson speaks.
But what about the argument he says that this question of it being non-statutory? What's the point of having this non-statutory thing? Why don't you just improve the law?
Well, it's not a case of either or. I think it's important that we in government, as I mentioned, are careful about those whom we fund. We know that there have been instances in the past of the government funding or state agencies supporting organisations and individuals with an extremist ideology, and it's important that we don't do that. But it is also the case, of course, that we need to be vigilant about the law and how it's used. And I know that there are forthcoming reports, for example, from Lord Walney, from John Woodcock, the former Labour MP, that have some recommendations about how the law can also be improved to complement work in this space.
You'll know that your Conservative colleague Zainab Arsi isn't wholly convinced, to put it mildly. So she said that members of the Muslim community in this country, and I quote, are concerned about the government playing dangerous and divisive politics. And she goes on, in Michael Gove, she says Michael Gove will not divide us in his ideological pursuit of a policy that's been rejected and criticised by victims of terrorism, ex-Home Secretaries, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury. What would you say to your colleague?
I have an enormous respect for Saida, and it's part of a healthy democracy that different people have different views on how best to deal with extremism. I know that Saida is a brave and principled voice, and in advance of our announcement today, and there's still more detail, of course, which I will share with the House of Commons, and it's only right that I should share with the House of Commons first. In advance of that, there's been some speculation about what we may or may not do. That speculation, those concerns have been expressed by people whom I admire, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I think that the approach that we're taking is a focused and proportionate one, and indeed in the reaction that we've had today, there are some who are concerned that we're going too far, others who express concern that we're not going far enough. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily right, but it does mean that there is a spectrum of opinion, and I hope that once we've made our statement to the House of Commons today on behalf of the government, that people will be able to calmly assess what we're doing and then make a judgment about whether or not this is the right way of dealing with what everyone recognises is a real problem of ideologically driven hate.
And it's something you've been thinking about for decades. It's perfectly reasonable for people to change their minds, and we should be very wary of what some people call offence archaeology. But in a very different era, 2006, after the Iraq War, after 7/7, you wrote in your book, Celsius 7/7, that a sizable minority of British Muslims hold rejectionist Islamist views. Do you believe that there is evidence to support such an assertion today?
Well, the evidence that I was citing then was statistical evidence from opinion surveys at that time. But I'm grateful you asked this question because it allows me to stress something very important. There is a huge difference between Islam, a religion of peace that inspires in millions acts of charity and kindness, and which is a boon to the world, and Islamism, which is a specific ideology. It's a specific ideology that draws from the teachings of Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is a specific ideology that seeks not only to separate Muslims from the rest of society, but to divide Muslims themselves, and which seeks the creation of essentially an authoritarian or totalitarian form of rule.
I remember when the book came out, I read it, and I thought you actually made that distinction clear in the book. The question I was asking about now was, do you believe that there's evidence to support such an assertion today? You're talking about statistics which you cited then. Do you know statistics? Is it your view that today, based on evidence you may have seen, you may believe you've seen, that a sizable minority of British Muslims hold rejectionist Islamist views?
Again, I don't have access to statistical evidence about that, but what I do know is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims with whom we've been working want to ensure that we can counter extremism effectively, and I want to strengthen the hand of British Muslims who are operating on the ground, both to counter extremism and to counter anti-Muslim hatred as well. And that is why we want to work with partners. We want to fund community organisations. There are great organisations like Tel Mama, which call out anti-Muslim hatred and fight extremism. We want to go further. In doing so, we need to be careful, of course, because in the past, good-hearted people within government that have wanted to do this work have found themselves inadvertently funding or working with extremist organisations, and it's by drawing that clear distinction that we think we can empower the overwhelming majority of not just British Muslims, but the overwhelming majority of British citizens who want to come together in order to promote social cohesion.
Michael Gove, Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
It is 8:25. We want our rivers to be sewage-free and usable as a resource. It doesn't seem much to us, but it is not always happening, as many of us know. I'm in Bristol this morning, where the Avon is certainly better treated than it was in the 70s when I grew up in these parts, but frankly that's not saying much, and it has happened largely because of local people forcing it to happen. Rave on for the Avon. See what they're doing there. Sounds better with a Bristolian accent, I think, but there we are. That's my go at it. A documentary about the local community's love for the river and their bid to make it safe to swim in is out now.
Oh, I swim in the river most days, rain or snow. That is nice, tingly. Oh, God.
And the water takes the pain away.
This would be my first time swimming in Palema. A little bit nervous. Let's see how it goes. Yeah, well, it's going to be fine. Let's go.
You never want to get out.
Like Mummy.
But I like to go underwater.
Because I know how clean this river is. Let's go.
There we are. Charlotte Sawyer is with me now, director of that documentary, and Becca Blease as well, who's a member of Conham Bathers. Thank you both for coming into our studio. Morning to you.
Morning.
Charlotte, first of all, what did you want to achieve?
I wanted to capture the love that people have for the river, but also the love they feel back when they engage in it, when they swim, when they walk next to it, when they see the gorgeous nature that's around it. And it wasn't hard to do, because all of the people that I followed, they just express it so beautifully.
Yeah, and there's this real sort of sense of warmth, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that you've captured?
Warmth, but also...
Possibly the wrong word to use, particularly this time of year.
I was going to say also cold and thrill, yeah. Excitement. Yeah. You know, we have people swimming through the whole year in the winter, in the snow, lots of very shocked, screaming and slightly orgasmic sounds sometimes of people, of the thrill that they get from the cold water. And it's very healing for some people, swim for medical reasons as well. And yeah, it's really important to them.
Becca, please, what's your involvement?
So I started a campaign a few years ago, actually, during the pandemic, to try to get designated bathing water status for this very special stretch of the Bristol Avon that Charlotte has captured in her film. The hope was simply that we would, that there are lots of people who swim there, but we didn't know anything about the quality of the water, whether it was still like the 70s, whether it has improved drastically. We don't know. It's a bit of a gamble every time you go in, and there wasn't any data that we could find about whether it's safe to swim or not. So I put together the campaign, and we've done a few years of our own sampling, and we've set up a sewage data dashboard.
And the story is what?
Well, the story of the film is, what's so great about the film is that a lot of river campaigning feels very frustrating. A lot of the time you're consistently, you know, community groups across the country consistently documenting sewage incidents after sewage incidents and throwing these stats out, and nothing seems to stick a lot of the time. And what you don't see is that no campaign group starts simply because they enjoy being angry. It starts because they love a river and they want to cherish it, and they feel a joy from it. And that's what we don't hear as much in the media around the sewage scandal. You know, quite rightly so. It sticks to the negative aspects, all those sewage data reports. But I think that positive message is really important too. You need to see how important rivers are to people.
Yeah, I mean that's the point, isn't it, Charlotte? Is this a story of progress being made, or is it a story of just of a protest and things that have gone wrong and still go wrong?
Protests happen. I mean, the film lends its name from a rave that was organised as Becca and the Conham Bathers handed in a petition at Bristol City Council.
Which is a brilliant name.
Yeah, it was October, it was cold outside, and people were raving in their swimsuits to drum and bass while the petition was being handed in. There are campaign moments, you know, but really it's from the eyes of the campaigners and the river users themselves. And, you know, we see a frustrating meeting between someone who won't pay their bills and the Chief Operations Officer for Wessex Water, who's trying to convince that person to pay their bills. But then we actually end with a wedding ceremony of, you know, a woman that wants to express how rivers should have rights and personhood, and she's trying to make a creative, artistic statement. So it's not about kind of it's filmed over 6 seasons, but it's not necessarily about these campaign wins and losses, but it's about people's experience of love.
And of course, in many respects, Becca, it's not just about Bristol and the Avon, is it? It's about people right around the country, right around the UK will know about their own rivers and wonder whether things like this actually do have long-term an effect on the water companies and on their behaviour.
Yeah, well, I think the film will certainly help keep it in the agenda, keep it in the minds of both the water companies and the council and politicians, decision makers. You know, this isn't an issue that's going away. I think water companies probably hoped it would, that it would just simply go away after how many articles come out saying, the number of hundreds of thousands of sewage being spilled, and we collect data like that as well. But it's not going away. That's what's really interesting to see, that there's more and more momentum across the country.
Becca Blease and Charlotte Sawyer, director of the Avon River documentary. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
7:30, and Kathy's here with the sport. Hi, Kathy.
Hello, 8:30, hopefully.
Almost
Staged the biggest comeback. Yeah, it has been. Staged the biggest comeback win in more than 20 years in the Premier League. 3-0 down at half-time. They completed a 4-3 victory in an extraordinary game at Vitality Stadium. In the Scottish Premiership, Aberdeen are just 3 points above the relegation playoff spots now after a 1-0 defeat to Dundee. Ross County and Inverness drew 2-2. And Borussia Dortmund and Atletico Madrid are through to the Champions League quarter-finals, with Liverpool, Rangers, West Ham and Brighton in Europa League action tonight. The Wales centre, George North, has announced he will retire from international rugby after this weekend's Six Nations game against Italy. It will be his 121st appearance for Wales. Now, the defending champions in Rugby League's Super League, Wigan Warriors, are top of the table. They take on, though, Salford, who could overtake them with a win tonight. We can speak to Kevin Brown, the former England halfback who has played for both clubs and is involved in the 5 Sports Extra commentary tonight. Kevin, morning. Few weeks into the season now. It is tight at the top of the table, but this is a good challenge for Salford to see where they are, I guess, against the champions Wigan.
Yeah, it is. I think Wigan, you've got to give them a massive amount of credit for what they've done so far. Obviously the world champions, but they've had no dip in form after that. There's normally a bit of a hangover, and they've been great. But Salford, yeah, they're a tricky side. They've been punching above the weight. They showed last weekend that they beat St Helens on their own patch, and they're I think they're sat in third now. They're 3 from 4, so it's going to be a terrific game.
Yeah, looking forward to that one. I just was interested in administration and financial issues, obviously, that we've seen in rugby union over the last couple of seasons. All sports really being careful and looking at their funding models. How concerned are rugby league clubs, given they're often at the heart of their communities, about all of that?
Oh, definitely there's a concern, but not only recently, there has been a concern for, since Super League started. And one of the best things that I feel for the sustainability of the sport was the salary cap. The salary cap was brought in, and that meant that you could only spend, a proportion of your earnings, which made it more of a business rather than a rich benefactor coming in and pushing a load of money, signing a load of players, and if they're left, then the club's in trouble. And that's what you've seen in rugby union, building all that debt up. And in rugby league, the benefactors have been coming in, but it's more to make a difference rather than just to plug the gaps.
And what about attendances? Every sport competing for attention. Super League attendances, I think, have been quite impressive at the start of this season. A combined attendance that was 10% higher than last season's opening games. What do you put that down to?
Just the appetite of the sport. I think the fact that we had a World Cup challenge over in England at Wigan, and Wigan won that. The buzz around the sport's been incredible. Like you say, a 10% increase. There was a record, for the round 1 cumulative fixtures, which was great. But it's just the exposure for me. I think that it's the first time that BBC have been showing league matches. Every game you can watch on TV. There's so many good games, and I'll go back to the salary cap again. There's more than just one team that can win this competition. There's many sides, and it's meant that the level playing field has been that, and it's been level. No one can spend much more money because they've got more money. So yeah, I think that the fact that there are so many close games, every fan, even the most pessimistic fans, can turn up to a game and expect their side to win.
Yeah, and that's probably borne out, although it's early days, by how close the top of that table is. Kevin Brown, thanks very much, part of the 5 Sports Extra commentary tonight. Just to mention a couple of other things. Tennis London, Indian Wells, the world number 2, Arina Sabalenka, lost to America's Emma Navarro in the 4th round. Coco Gauff on her 20th birthday beat Elise Mertens. Also through to the quarterfinals, Iga Swiatek, Daniil Medvedev and Yannick Sinner. And trainer Willie Mullins claimed an historic 100th Cheltenham Festival victory yesterday. He's the first person to post a century of wins at the festival, and Captain Guinness, ridden by Rachel Blackmore, secured a surprise win in the Queen Mother Champion Chase. Kudos to Gary, who tipped Captain Guinness yesterday. Try these from Cheltenham Festival today: 2:50 number 11 Stage Star, 4 number 7 Shake 'em Up Harry.
Gary, of course, will be too modest to mention it.
Never.
Not. Thanks, Carthy. 9 o'clock this morning, Melvyn Bragg presenting a rhythmical edition of In Our Time.
Hello, we'll be talking about the waltz, which emerged here in the 1810s, most likely from Germany. Before, people had danced side by side. Now they were face to face, body to body, twirling around with increasingly daring exuberance. It became a feature of dances in great country houses and soon the populace, such as in Wigton, where my mother and myself would go to socials in the hall under the Congregational Church, and after a pea and pie supper, bring your own knife and fork, get on the floor and stomp through St Bernard's Waltz. That's the history of the waltz with Teresa Butland, Susan Jones and Derek Scott on BBC Sounds, and on Radio 4 this morning just after 9 o'clock. Now, back to today.
Well, thank you, Melvyn. Quick look at weather. Well, it says here, largely cloudy and wet today, which does potentially create some room for sunshine somewhere, with spells of heavy rain in the north and heavy showers in the south.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4 at the Mulraj in London, Justin Webb in Bristol. It is 24 minutes to 9. Alan Smith has the news.
The government has set out a new definition of extremism to assess whether groups should be cut off from government grants and support. It'll cover organisations perceived as promoting an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance. The Communities Secretary Michael Gove told us that ministers wanted to avoid the errors of the past where government money went to organisations that were extremist. The Israeli military says it plans to move more than 1 million displaced Palestinians in Gaza to what it calls humanitarian island in the middle of the street. Due to factors such as obesity.
Thank you. It is 23 minutes to 9. We heard Michael Gove defending the government's extremism list half an hour or so ago. We also heard criticism of it earlier in the programme. What do Labour make of it? Let us talk to Darren Jones, who's the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and is on the line now. Morning, Mr Jones.
Hi, good morning.
What do you make of, I don't know if you heard what Michael Gove was saying, but he was interesting about how this list is going to be arrived at. Not, he says, just one person, one minister acting alone, but a centre of excellence involving independent civil servants. Does that put any worries you might have to rest?
Not really. I mean, to start with, clearly there is a cross-party political consensus that hateful extremism is not welcome in our society, should not be tolerated, and action should be taken. So we all agree on the starting position. The slight confusion really is that the government is focused on this definition today, which is not in relation to the counter-extremism strategy, which is now 9 years out of date. It's not an action plan for agencies and others about what action they should take in communities across the country. It's not even a legal definition. All it really does, as I'm sure you've talked about, is prevent the government from financing organisations or individuals. That rather implies that Michael Gove is worried they're doing that at the moment, which raises more questions than he's been able to answer this morning.
So would you not do it?
Well, it looks like he's doing it today, and so if we win the next election, we will inherit the status quo. But I do have concerns around the process and the checks and balances here. It's very unusual for officials to make recommendations to Michael Gove's local government secretary. James Cleverly is the foreign secretary, to designate organisations in this way without any right of administrative appeal or checks and balances in Parliament. The only route people can take to challenge a decision by Michael Gove is to launch a judicial review in the High Court, which is a very expensive complicated process which many organisations would not be able to afford to do.
But the alternative then to this list is what in Labour's view?
Well, that's why you have to, one, have the debate about the definition, whether it's too wide or too narrow, and we will talk about that today in Parliament when we understand more of the detail from Michael Gove. But then you have to make sure that if you're going to pursue this agenda, as I say, you have the proper right to appeal and you have proper checks and balances in place.
I want to turn to what happened or didn't happen, I suppose, in the Commons yesterday, with Diane Abbott wanting, obviously, to ask a question about her treatment at the hands of a Tory donor, a question of the Prime Minister, and not being called by the Speaker. Did the Speaker, in your view, make a mistake?
I think it was surprising that Diane wasn't called, given the context of Prime Minister's questions yesterday. I think Mr. Speaker has given a statement which points to the fact that it is normal procedure during Prime Minister's questions that members are called based on their success in the ballot. It's a raffle system, basically, to get a question in Prime Minister's questions. And the Speaker would only normally call additional speakers, one, if there is time to do so, and two, if there is a cross-party balance. And he took the view yesterday that he couldn't meet either the time or the balance requirements for calling speakers, people to ask questions in Prime Minister's questions. That's the position he's put, but I do recognise that it was perhaps a little odd that Diane wasn't given the opportunity to speak.
Well, I mean, she says it was more than that, that really, I mean, the thrust of what she's saying, and she's written for the papers this morning, is that it's really outrageous. This was something that was aimed at her. She was very obviously had a question to ask. She had standing, as it were, in that it was about her. And it is possible for a speaker to call anyone to speak, isn't it? I just wonder in those circumstances whether she might think your words this morning are a little weak.
I'm just telling you what the facts are as they've been presented by Mr. Speaker. Well, as I said, I think it was a little unusual that she wasn't called in the circumstances. I think that
a little unusual. I mean, some people are saying more than that it was outrageous.
Well, you can say that. If I was in the chair, I probably would have decided to call her, but I wasn't. Mr. Speaker normally is very generous in giving time, especially to backbenchers in insensitive circumstances such as these. I don't know whether Diane gave advance warning to the Speaker for her intention to want to speak or not, but clearly who Mr. Speaker calls in Prime Minister's questions is a decision for Mr. Speaker.
Just going back then to the extremism rules that are going to come out, the next step is this list, isn't it? I mean, do you have fears about who will be on that list? And would you say to the government, indeed would you say to those people, that they ought to have the right at least to challenge the list legally?
So as a point of constitutional principle, I think anybody should have the right to challenge a decision that's taken by ministers. And in these circumstances, given the high threshold for judicial review, I think there should be a right of appeal in the system. In respect of the list generally, we'll need to see what's on it. Michael Gove has refused to give any clarity on that this morning, and we'll speak to the Commons later today, and we'll have to see how they've come to the conclusions they've come to.
Darren Jones, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
18 minutes to 9, the BBC has found that an AI weapons scanner under a US investigation for marketing practices has backtracked on claims it was tested by the UK government. After saying its weapons scanning technology had been tested and found to be highly effective, it has now told the BBC it's changed the wording on its website to better reflect the process taken. Our technology correspondent James Clayton joined me earlier, and I started by asking him what the background to all this was.
So Evolve Technology is a company that's business model is essentially to replace metal detectors with smart scanners that use AI. So these scanners are, in theory, able to detect concealed weapons like guns and bombs and knives and then alert on them. And the idea of this tech is you don't have to go through these cumbersome metal detectors when going to schools, stadiums. The Manchester Arena uses it. The problem the company has is it's faced multiple accusations that it's overstated how powerful its technology is, basically how effective it is. And in the US, the company is being sued by a person who was stabbed in a school where Evolve operates, and they're also under investigation by the Securities Exchange Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission is looking at the company's marketing practices. There's a lot of interest at the moment in what the company is saying publicly.
And what have you found, James?
Well, we looked at an interesting statement that Evolve put out last month. It said that the UK government had tested Evolve's system and found it to be highly effective. Evolve claimed that the National Protective Security Authority had tested its systems. So just to make that clear, they were saying this in the US, that the UK government had tested its scanner and found it to be highly effective. The problem is the NPSA doesn't do testing of that nature. And when we put that to Evolve, they said that they'd spoken with the NPSA and amended the language, saying that in fact it was a private company that had evaluated and validated the technology. But when we spoke to that company, they said that whilst they'd carried out tests, it's not their role to validate the tech. Now, Evolve has now changed the wording on its website and said that there'd been some confusion. But considering the background of Evolve and the accusations around overstating what the tech can do, this is a pretty serious revelation.
And does it get into a wider problem that many tech companies in particular seem to have of overclaiming what their tech can do?
Yeah, there's definitely a worry in the US that technology companies overclaim what they can do. I mean, I lived in San Francisco, Silicon Valley for years. It's a really common thing and very often it's overlooked. However, with Evolve, it's different because they're in the security space. They're not selling advertising on social media. And that means there's an awful lot more scrutiny in what they say publicly.
James, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
It is 14 minutes to 9. The crisis in Haiti remains appalling for the many, many civilians caught up in it. The Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, has resigned. Gangs are in control of more than 80% of the capital, Port-au-Prince. So, amid the chaos and the instability, the Dominican Republic, Haiti's neighbor, is having to cope with it and is deporting thousands of Haitians back across their land border every day. Our Central America correspondent, Will Grant, reports now from that border crossing, and some of what you hear may be upsetting.
Even at Haiti's lowest ebb, migration trucks keep coming to the Dajabon border crossing. Scores of undocumented Haitians, some of whom have spent years living in the Dominican Republic, are deported to a nation in turmoil.
Some angry, some resigned, but they're all going back across the border, straight into a nation in crisis, a country actually living its worst moment, most acute humanitarian crisis since the 2010 earthquake.
Michael Petiton says he spent 3 years as a construction worker in the Dominican Republic before the authorities entered his home and detained him. In essence, it seems the Dominican government is sending a message. No matter how bad things get in Haiti, its people should not expect to find refuge in its neighbor's territory.
The current situation in Port-au-Prince, the capital city of Haiti, is a humanitarian catastrophe for its 3 million inhabitants, and more specifically for women and girls.
And things are currently very bad, says the UN Population Fund's Haiti representative, Philippe Serge Dejernier.
Out of the 15 hospitals that UNFPA is supporting, only one is currently functioning and is completely overwhelmed by the situation. We have estimated that about 3,000 women will not have access to maternity in order to give birth if the situation is not calming down.
For so many in Haiti, life is now a critical struggle to find enough food or to make ends meet. Furthermore, the UNFPA warns that rape and sexual abuse are being used as weapons of war in the Haitian capital.
Last year, more than 5,000 women were raped or victims of sexual abuse. And that is, unfortunately, a very tiny part of the iceberg. Most of the time, women don't dare to go to the hospital to be treated because there may be some retaliation, and sometimes retaliation goes up to killing this poor woman.
Depuis plus passé en semaine, pays noirs à vivre.
Regional diplomats see the resignation of Prime Minister Ariel Henry, which he confirmed on Monday, as the first step towards stability.
We expect that the members of the Transitional Council will be appointed in the next 24 to 48 hours.
The US State Department confidently spoke of a transitional council being in place within 2 days. There's still no sign of one, and while most in Port-au-Prince are glad to see the back of Ariel Henry, many are frustrated at the lack of a clear plan. Henri's resignation is a good thing, says Ms. Benjamin, the storeholder. He wasn't doing anything good for this country. Now we must unite to pull Haiti out of this mess. Ariel Henry was the biggest obstacle we had. He had to go, adds another resident, Emmanuel. But we should have had a proper plan to replace him. At the land crossing between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Dominican soldiers wield tasers at the returning Haitians. There's a long and bitter history between these two nations which share a Caribbean island. And even with Haiti on the brink of collapse, only a handful of Haitians are being allowed to leave. Meanwhile, for the thousands being deported into Haiti each day, the future has rarely looked so uncertain or dangerous.
Will Grant reporting. Well, as Justin was discussing with Darren Jones a short time ago, many observers, including Diane Abbott herself, felt there was something rather unsatisfactory yesterday about watching MPs discuss her, but the Speaker of the House of Commons failing to choose her to give her own view in the Commons debate. And the issue in question, which they were all discussing, was alleged comments by Frank Hester, a Tory donor reported by The Guardian, who's reported to have said that looking at Diane Abbott makes you want to hate all black women, and that she, and I quote, should be shot. We have, of course, asked Diane Abbott MP on, and we'll be delighted to speak to her about this if she fancies coming on. What's it like being on the receiving end of misogyny mixed with racism in public, particularly with modern social media? Well, someone who knows is Gina Miller, businesswoman, activist who fought Brexit, leader of the True and Fair Party, who's also prospective parliamentary candidate for Epsom and Ewell. Miss Miller, good morning.
Good morning.
Before we get into Diane Abbott, I wonder if we could just detail, you could just detail, and I do mean detail, some of the abuse that you've received in the past, because of course it takes many forms, doesn't it? Physical threats, digital threats, and then press coverage, which some people would call abusive too.
Yes, it's come from every medium you can imagine. I've even been sent cartoon strips of me being raped to dolls with pins in it. You know, the abuse has come from